Hey y'all, welcome to Book Marketing Mania. I'm your host, Kim Stewart, and my mission is to help you build relationships and reach new readers by guesting on podcasts. So one of the biggest pet peeves I hear from podcast hosts is that their guests don't share their interviews. Yikes, that's so disappointing, y'all. Because most of the time, we as guests have asked for the incredible privilege to be a guest on their show. Then they allow us to share our God-given message with their listeners that they've worked really hard to serve well. Then our interview airs and it's crickets. No matter how many times a guest is given shareable images ahead of time or tagged on social posts, the guests sometimes don't share. Y'all, we gotta do better. And I do mean we, because I need to work on this myself. I was looking in Philippians 2, verse 4, and Paul writes, "Don't look out only for your own interest, but take an interest in others too." And I like to also check out the Message version because it often hits home, especially from the lens of marketing our messages. And Philippians 2, verse 4 in the Message says, "Don't be obsessed with getting your own advantage. Forget yourselves long enough to lend a helping hand." Oh my gosh, y'all, this is what marketing is all about, relationships and helping others. So even sharing our interview once isn't enough. Remember, we have goals for being a podcast guest. Building relationships, definitely number one. Growing your email list, selling books, growing your own show, building your platform, and attracting a publisher, just to name a few. And the more you share your interviews, the more people that will have the opportunity to listen and be blessed, and the faster you will meet your goals. So today we're going to talk about 7 ways to share your guest episodes so you can delight your podcast host and your target readers too. So let's get to it. Okay, so if you're a note taker like me, I'll have this list of 7 ways to share your guest interviews in the show notes on the blog, and you can always find them at bookmarketingmania.com or see the link here in your own podcast player. And as we go through this list, remember, you don't have to do them all right away. This is just a variety of ways that you can share your guest interviews. Pick what works for you, and in addition to sharing when the episode airs, plan to reshare it again and again in the future. Why? Because the number one return on podcast guesting is the relationships you build with hosts and how it leads to amazing collaborations and introductions in the future to your new target readers. And when you want to pitch your next book or your burning topic on your heart in the future, you're going to be so glad you stayed top of mind with the podcast host as the go-to guest when you continue to share your interviews and tag the host. So let's get to that list. Number 1, share a graphic or a screenshot of your interview on social media and tag your host. This is by far the easiest and fastest one that you can do. You can just share a graphic on social. You can use the graphic that your host provides you, or just take a screenshot as you're listening to the interview in your podcast player or on your desktop, or go to the host blog post if they have one and grab the image there. Now, my clients often ask, what if the host doesn't let us know the episode has gone live? Or if they don't let us know when the episode will go live, right? So I encourage everybody to set Google alerts with your name and the name of your book, period. And then as you start podcast pitching, also set a Google alert for the name of the podcast. And that way you'll get an alert in your email box that some topic with those keywords hit the internet. So you can also note it on your tracking spreadsheet, which I always recommend using when you're podcast pitching. You can make a note of what day that host airs their episodes and set a reminder to check it each week. And of course, if you're already following the podcast, like we talked about in building relationships with podcast hosts before pitching, you're already following the podcast in your favorite player. And so you're likely going to see the episode pop up there. So number 2, you can create an audiogram and share it so your followers can hear a snippet of your audio interview. And then they're going to want to click over and listen to the whole thing, right? Because they've heard that little teaser. So there's a couple of places you can do this. I love using WAVE, WAVVE .co. And you can also create one on canva.com or use the Canva app, or you can use the Headliner app like my client, Christine Brown, author of Cinched, is really good about doing this. She uses the Headliner app to create a audiogram, and it's always the image that the host has provided her or an image of the podcast that she's going to be a guest on. And then she pulls a clip and shares it on social, and I love that so much. Spotify is another easy way to do this. You could be listening to a podcast in Spotify and hit the share button and say share to Instagram, and it automatically create the exact image you need with the audio included and a picture of the podcast. So number 3, you could create a short video to share about your episode. If you're comfortable talking to camera, create a short video sharing about your interview, who it was with, and what topic you covered. And if you're not a fan of talking on video or showing your face, which I totally get, take a short video of like your screen as you're listening to the episode. You could still use your voice, or if you're filming a reel, you could make it fun with some trending audio and just put a text bubble or two with some quotes from your interview. Then number 4, share your interview with your email list. My client, Amy Debrick, host of Life on Purpose and co-author of Emboldened, does such a great job of this. She includes the podcast graphic along with a blurb about the interview, and she makes sharing her interviews part of her email content plan. So she might share about the episode the day it airs on her Instagram stories, but then she puts it in her content rotation to share with her email list. So one week they might see it on her social media, but a few weeks later they might read about it in her email. And for those of you groaning that interviews air all on the same day or all on the same week during your book launch, and you think it's just too much to share, and that's why you don't do it, well, I have a couple of ideas for you coming up on a future episode. Okay, number 5, share the interview with your own podcast listeners. So if you're a podcast host, you could give a shout out at the beginning or the end of your podcast episode to let your listeners know so they can go check out the interview. Podcast listeners love discovering new shows to listen to. Believe me, I know. And that's why it's the number 1 way to grow your own show. So share the interview with your podcast listeners. And a great way to do this is if you are on Buzzsprout, which I highly recommend for your podcast hosting. They're amazing. They have something called dynamic content, and it's a feature that you can use. It's free. And what they do is you could record a little self-sponsored ad that says, hey, I was a guest on podcast XYZ talking about XYZ topic this week. I'd love for you to tune into it. You could record that, and then you go into Buzzsprout and tell them you want to add that dynamic content where you want it. Do you want it at the beginning of the episode or at the end of the episode? And then you tell them what episodes you want to add it to. It could be your whole content library, like no matter how many episodes you have. And that way, say you were a guest this week, episode on your own podcast airs this week, then everybody that listens to any podcast in your library would hear that ad for your guest episode that week. And then you could take it out whenever you're ready, swap it out with another one or another dynamic content ad, or just take it off altogether. And if that sounds confusing, don't worry. I have an upcoming episode on all these cool ways you could use Buzzsprout's dynamic content to market your message. And hey, before I get to number 6, if you need help with building your author platform or marketing your book as a guest on podcast, I'd love to chat about how I can help you. So head over to bookmarketingmania.com and book your free call today. So number 6, add the interview to your media page. When podcast hosts and event coordinators come to check you out as a potential guest speaker, they'll see where else you've been a guest and be able to listen to a sample of you speaking if you link the interview. And this could be just something super simple on your website. If you don't have it already, you can just have it at the top, have a tab that says media or press, however you want to reference it, and then just have a list of the shows that you have been on with links to them. That's all it has to be. Plus, it shows potential agents and publishers that you are actively serving your target readers today, in case guesting on podcast is one of your goals to attract agents and publishers. And then finally, number 7, add your interview to your podcast playlist of interviews if you have one. So having a playlist is an easy way to share your interviews so others can see all the shows you've guested on and the different topics you can speak on with audio samples. So this might be something you could add to your media page. Like you'll have like maybe every single podcast graphic listed and maybe you have links. But if you didn't want to do all that, you could just have a link to a playlist that goes elsewhere where they could go and they they could pick the shows to listen to. And it's super easy to create a podcast guest playlist on Spotify or Podchaser or Listen Notes. And once you create it there, they just give you the embed code you can put on your website, or you could share it on social. You could link it in your show notes if you're a podcast host. Or if you want to get even fancier, you could create your own guest cast, which is a podcast simply for airing your podcast interviews. It's so genius, so super cool. And my guest, Thomas Umstad, shared about it in episode 27. So I'll be sure and put a link to that in the show notes. So that's 7 ways to share your interviews as a guest. And again, you don't have to do all of these, and certainly not all at once. Do what works for you and your own readers, and continue to share your interview as part of your content plan. It's great evergreen content, and there's always new readers and listeners to share it with. And definitely tag your podcast host when you do to show your appreciation of them having you on the show. So I mentioned this in episode 48 on how to be a great podcast guest, but the host might forget what you said or did, but they will not forget the way you made them feel, especially when you share your interview. Because remember, podcast guesting and book marketing is all about building relationships and helping people. And speaking of helping people, I wanted to give a quick shout out to one of our listeners who left a review of the show. Heidi Ho to You says, such helpful tips and encouragement for marketing without making you feel sleazy for sharing the message God gave you to share. I wish I knew your first name so I could give you a proper shout out. If that's you, connect with me on Instagram because I'd love to. Thank you. And if you find these episodes helpful as you guest on podcasts to build your platform long before and long after your book launch, I'd be so grateful if you left a review so other writers and authors can discover the show. So thanks for tuning in this week, and I will see you guys here next week as I'll be sharing how to repurpose your guest interviews into even more content to help your target readers. See you then.